The morning after the fire, Matilda Gentry stood in the ash-gray ruin of everything she had ever owned, and every single person in Caldwell, Kansas came to offer her their sorrow. Every person, that is, except for Graham Whitaker, who came instead with a shovel slung over his shoulder and a look in his dark eyes that said he thought grieving could wait until there was something worth grieving over again. It was the autumn of 1874, and Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip like a town that hadn't yet decided if it wanted to be civilized or wild, straddling that invisible line between the cattle trail and the courthouse, with all the awkward confidence of a man wearing a new suit in a saloon. The Santa Fe Railway had pushed through only a year before, and the cattle drive still rolled in from Texas with their dust and their noise and their money, and the town had grown fat and restless on all three. There were 3 saloons, a livery, a general store, a small church with a leaking roof, a land office, and a doctor whose hands shook after noon. And there was the Gentry Bakery, which had stood at the corner of Main and Second for 6 years under the sign that read Gentry's Fine Bread and Pastry, in letters that Matilda's late husband, Daniel, had painted himself the week they opened. Now the sign was a curl of black wood on a mound of cinders. The fire had started sometime around 2 in the morning, when Matilda was asleep in the back room where she always slept during the busy weeks, close to the ovens, so she could rise at 4 and have the first loaves ready before the drovers came in from camp. She had smelled the smoke before she had seen the flame, and she had gotten herself out through the side window with nothing but her nightgown and the small tin box she kept under her cot where Daniel's watch and her wedding ring and $42 in savings lived. She had stood in the dirt alley and watched the building burn with a feeling she could not name, not panic exactly, and not quite grief, but something very close to the sensation of a floor dropping out from beneath your feet before you have had time to decide whether to step back or forward. The cause was a grease fire that had caught a cloth and moved faster than anyone could account for. The bucket brigade from the saloon got there eventually, and they saved the printing shop next door, but the bakery was gone. By 7 in the morning, she was sitting on the edge of the stone water trough across the street, still in her nightgown with a wool blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, and the town came to her in a steady stream. Mrs. Beaumont from the church auxiliary pressed her doughy hands around Matilda's and said, "What a tragedy, what a terrible tragedy." Sheriff Hollies tipped his hat and said he was awful sorry for her loss. The Reverend Cates prayed over her, which she bore with patience. Young Deputy Farris offered to write her mother back in Missouri if she wanted, and she said she didn't have a mother anymore, and he turned red and excused himself. Old Pete from the livery told her that Daniel would have been heartbroken, and that was the one that almost broke her, because it was true, and because Daniel had been gone 2 years and she was still not accustomed to the weight of his absence. She thanked every one of them. She kept her spine straight and her voice even, and she thanked them, because that was the thing Matilda Gentry knew how to do. She had been thanking people for their condolences since she was 24 years old and her husband had died of a fever that came on fast and took him in 4 days, leaving her with the bakery and a town that wasn't sure whether to admire her for keeping it running or pity her for needing to. She had chosen admiration, and she had worked herself half to nothing to earn it, and now she was sitting in her nightgown in the street and the bakery was ash. She was 26 years old, and she had nothing left but the tin box and the wool blanket and $42. It was into this particular moment, when the stream of sympathizers had thinned and she was sitting alone with the blanket pulled tight and the sun coming up mean and yellow over the rooftops, that Graham Whitaker walked across the street toward her. She knew him by sight, the way everyone in Caldwell knew everyone by sight. He was 31 years old, which she knew because she had heard it mentioned. He had come to Caldwell 2 years ago and bought the lot at the edge of town that nobody else had wanted, because it sat low and was prone to mud in the spring, and he had built a cattle operation on it through what appeared to be sheer stubbornness and a refusal to acknowledge difficulty. He ran a modest herd and contracted out to some of the trail bosses coming up from Texas. He had a reputation for being fair and for being quiet, and the quiet part was the thing most people mentioned first, as though it were slightly suspicious in a town that ran on noise. He was not a handsome man in any conventional sense. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that was all angles and weathering a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone as the Kansas bluffs, a nose that had been broken at least once, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, green-brown and serious. He wore his dark hair a little long, curling at the collar, and he had a day's worth of stubble that suggested he had not thought to shave that morning, or perhaps had thought to and decided against it. He always wore his hat straight, which Matilda had noticed before and found inexplicably steady, the way a man who wore his hat straight seemed to believe in something. He walked across the street with a long-handled shovel resting across one shoulder, and he stopped in front of her, and he did not say he was sorry. He looked at the ruin of the bakery for a moment, then he looked at her. His expression was not cold, it was something else entirely, something that was more like recognition or respect, or perhaps both. "You're going to need to clear the foundation before you can build," he said. "The stone footings are still good, I can see from here." Matilda stared at him. "The ash needs to come out and the burned timber needs to go before the ground freezes," he continued, in that unhurried way he had of speaking, as if he were consulting the land rather than hurrying toward a conclusion. "That gives you maybe 6 weeks, 7 if this fall runs warm." She looked at the shovel. It was a well-made tool, iron-headed and hickory-handled, with the kind of wear on it that told you it had done years of honest work. "You are offering me a shovel," she said. "I am offering you my help clearing the site," he said. "The shovel goes with the offer." The rest of the street was quiet. A wagon went past on Main. A dog lay in a patch of morning sun outside the saloon and ignored everything. Matilda looked at Graham Whitaker for a long moment, measuring something about him that she could not entirely articulate, and then she looked back at the ruin of her bakery. "All right," she said. He nodded, as though this were the answer he had expected. He leaned the shovel against the water trough, stripped off his coat, and hung it over the trough's rim. Then he rolled his shirt sleeves to the elbow and picked up the shovel and walked toward the ruin, and Matilda watched him begin without ceremony, without preamble, without another word, and she felt something shift inside her. Some small internal counterweight she hadn't known was off balance, settling into a different position. She borrowed a pair of trousers and a shirt from Mrs. Landers at the boarding house, where she would be staying until she could determine a next step, and she was back at the site in 20 minutes with a second shovel that she borrowed from the hardware store's front porch. And when she came back, Graham Whitaker looked at her and gave a short nod that felt, somehow, like the warmest thing anyone had said to her all morning. They worked through the whole of that first day. The work was hard and filthy and deeply satisfying, in the way that only physical labor can be, when the alternative is sitting still with your thoughts. The ash was heavy with the moisture of the bucket brigade's water, and the burned timber had to be moved piece by piece, and the stone footings, Graham had been right, were solid and plumb and perfectly good. Matilda had laid those stones herself with Daniel the first summer they were married, mixing the mortar on a day so hot that it dried almost as fast as they could set it, laughing at the absurdity of it, and the stones had held for 6 years and they were still holding. They did not talk much for the first several hours. There was a rhythm to the work that made conversation feel unnecessary, and Matilda found, to her mild surprise, that the silence with Graham Whitaker was not uncomfortable in the way that silence with most people was. With most people, silence required management, required filling, required the small social work of appearing at ease. With him, it was simply 2 people doing a thing that needed doing. Around midday, Mrs. Landers brought them a basket with cornbread and cold chicken and 2 tin cups of coffee, and they sat on the stone footings and ate, and Graham looked at the cleared section and said, with the same unhurried confidence he'd brought everything, "You'll have it ready by end of the week if the weather holds." "You think I should rebuild," Matilda said. It was not quite a question. He looked at her steadily. "I think that's your decision. I think the foundation is sound, and the lot is yours, and the town still needs a bakery. The town has managed without one since 2 this morning." "The town has managed badly without one since 2 this morning," he said, and something in his tone made it funny enough that she laughed, a short surprised laugh that felt strange after the morning's grief, but not wrong. "I don't have enough savings to rebuild," she said, because it was true and she was not the kind of woman who avoided true things. $42 won't cover lumber, let alone the equipment. Graham was quiet for a moment, drinking his coffee. "The Cattlemen's Association has a lending fund," he said at last. "Set up for members, but Cole Beaumont is president, and he owes me a favor I've never collected on. I think he could be persuaded to extend it." "I am not a cattleman." "No, but you feed cattlemen, which might be argued to be the more essential service." She looked at him. He was looking out at the cleared foundation with the quiet concentration he seemed to bring to everything, and she had the strange sensation that he had already thought this through, had considered it on the walk across the street that morning before he had ever opened his mouth, and that the shovel had been the beginning of a plan rather than a gesture. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his face then that was not quite easy to read, not guarded exactly, but careful, as though he were selecting from several true answers the one that was most honest without being too much. "Because you're not going to quit," he said simply, "and that seems like a thing worth helping." She did not know what to do with that, so she ate the rest of her cornbread and they went back to work. By the end of that first week, the site was cleared and the stone footings were cleaned, and Graham had, through some combination of quiet persistence and the favor he'd mentioned, arranged for Matilda to meet with Cole Beaumont at the land office on Friday morning. She wore her good blue dress, the one she'd brought from Missouri when she first came west with Daniel, which Mrs. Landers had pressed for her with a hot iron borrowed from the dress shop. She pinned her hair up carefully, because Matilda Gentry had learned early that when you were a widow woman asking men for money in the year 1874, you had to look like someone who deserved the consideration, which was a thing that made her quietly furious in the back of her mind, but did not change the practical necessity of it. Cole Beaumont was a heavy man with a red face and a gold watch chain, and the habitual expression of someone who believed his time was more valuable than anyone else's. He sat behind the big desk in the land office and looked at Matilda across it, and asked her a series of questions about her business that she answered clearly and without embroidery, because embroidery was for people who were ashamed of what was underneath, and she was not. The bakery had turned a profit in 5 of its 6 years of operation. She had 14 regular accounts with the drovers' camps during cattle season. She supplied the hotel and both of the larger saloons with bread on a weekly basis. She had before the fire been in the process of expanding to include pie orders for the hotel dining room, which she produced 3 times weekly, and which were, according to multiple sources, the best pie in the territory. Beaumont listened and stroked his watch chain, and seemed prepared to find reasons to decline until Graham, who had come and was standing to the side of the room in a way that managed to be both unobtrusive and impossible to ignore, said very quietly, "The association lent Dooley Harper money to reissue 40 horses he didn't own yet, Cole." There was a silence. $400, Beaumont said to Matilda. "Repayable over 18 months at 6%. You'll need a co-signer." Matilda was already opening her mouth to say something about co-signers and what she thought of that particular condition when Graham said, "I'll sign," with the same straightforward calm with which he'd offered the shovel, as if it were the obvious next thing in a sequence that had already been decided. She looked at him. He met her eyes, and there was no grand gesture in it, no performance of magnanimity. He was simply stating a fact. "You don't have to do that," she said. I know, he said. She turned back to Beaumont. Fine, she said. They both signed the paper, and Matilda walked out into the October sunshine with $400 in her hand, and the curious sensation of being both deeply grateful and somewhat unsettled, the way you feel when something shifts the ground beneath you, not unpleasantly but undeniably. Graham was walking beside her, pulling his coat back on against the October chill. You didn't have to do that, she said again, because she felt she needed to say it twice. No, he agreed. If I default, you're liable. I know what a co-signature means, Mrs. Gentry. She stopped on the boardwalk and turned to face him, and the sun was in his eyes and he squinted against it, which made him look for a moment less like a man who had everything arranged and more like an ordinary person caught in the light. I'm going to pay you back, she said. Not the association. You. Every cent of whatever risk you've taken on by putting your name to that. He looked at her for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved in what was, on his face, the equivalent of a broad smile. All right, he said. I'll hold you to it. Construction on the new bakery began the second week of October 1874. Graham organized the lumber order with the efficiency of a man who was accustomed to managing supply chains for cattle operations, which turned out to translate well to building supplies. He hired 2 carpenters from the next town over, brothers named Hess, who worked fast and clean and did not overcharge, and he negotiated on Matilda's behalf for the price of the iron stove, which she needed new because the old one was a melted wreck, and he drove down the ironmonger's asking price by $20 through what appeared to be a combination of knowing the man's name and not being in a hurry. Matilda watched all of this with a complicated mixture of appreciation and a mild bristling need to assert that she was capable of doing it herself. And one afternoon when she was watching him negotiate the stove price through the hardware store window, she made herself consider honestly whether she was irritated at him specifically, or at the fact that a man could walk into a room and be taken seriously in a way she could not always replicate, and she decided it was the latter. And that it was not Graham Whitaker's fault, and that being irritated at the situation was fair, and being irritated at him for navigating it would be both unfair and counterproductive. She told him this, more or less, one evening when they were both standing in the half-built frame of the new bakery, checking the level of the floor joists in the last of the October daylight. I appreciate what you're doing, she said carefully. I want you to know that, but I also want to be clear that I am capable of managing my own business. He set the level down and looked at her. I know that. Sometimes it seems like you're managing things that I could manage. You could manage them, he agreed. You'd also be managing the construction, the accounts, the supply orders, and the equipment at the same time, mostly by yourself in 6 weeks before the ground freezes, with $40 left in your savings. I have time you don't have right now. She looked at him for a moment. That is a very reasonable answer. I try, he said, and picked up the level again. It is slightly aggravating when you are reasonable, she said. I've heard that before, he said, and this time the corner of his mouth went further than usual. That was the evening something changed, or perhaps more accurately, that was the evening she noticed that something had been changing for a while. She walked back to the boarding house in the cool October dark, and she thought about the way he had said I know that, not quickly, not indulgently, not with the slightly patronizing warmth with which people usually agreed with women who asserted competence, but with simple, flat certainty, as though it were a piece of information he had stored and referenced as a matter of course. And she thought about the way he'd said you could manage them, which was not a dismissal of her capability, but an honest accounting of the arithmetic of time and energy. And she thought about the way the light had been going, and the frame of the new bakery had smelled of fresh-cut pine and wood shavings, and she had been standing close enough to him to catch the scent of him leather and clean sweat and something faintly like wood smoke, and she had not moved away, and he had not moved either. She was not naive. She had been married, and she had loved her husband, and she knew what it felt like when the physical presence of another person began to acquire a particular weight. She knew what it meant when you found yourself listening for footsteps you recognized, when you started to gauge a day partly by whether a certain person showed up in it. She told herself it was gratitude, which was true, and she told herself it was proximity, which was also true, and she told herself it was nothing more than that, which was becoming less true by the day. The bakery was finished the first week of November, 2 days before the first hard frost, which everyone in Caldwell agreed was a minor miracle of timing. It was a better building than the old one. The Hess brothers had done solid work, and Graham had insisted on proper fire boarding around the oven area, which had not been in the original plans but which Matilda agreed was not only wise, but would mean she could sleep without the particular anxiety that had lived in the back of her mind ever since the first building went up. The new sign said Gentry's Bakery in letters she painted herself, red on white, because Daniel's careful lettering style had been his, and she wanted this iteration of the place to be hers alone. The morning she opened, the line stretched down the boardwalk and around the corner, which she discovered when she came to unlock the door at 5 in the morning and nearly fell over the first person in it, who turned out to be old Pete from the livery, who said he'd been waiting since 4:30 because he'd been dreaming of her rye bread for 6 weeks. She baked until she had nothing left, and then she closed up and sat in the new back room, which smelled of pine and fresh bread, and she was so tired and so satisfied and so, unexpectedly, moved that she sat there for a solid 10 minutes doing nothing, which was not a thing Matilda Gentry generally permitted herself. Graham came at noon, which she had not expected because the bakery was obviously sold out and there was nothing to buy. He knocked at the back door and she opened it, and he had a bottle of rye whiskey in one hand and 2 tin cups in the other. "You're out of bread," he said. "Entirely," she said. "That seems like a reasonable occasion for celebration," he said. She stepped back to let him in, and he set the whiskey and the cups on the wooden work table and poured 2 measures and handed her one, and she drank it, because it was noon and the bakery was open, and she had made back a week's worth of loan payments in a single morning, and those seemed like sufficient reasons. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, the shovel, the foundation clearing, the lumber negotiation, the stove price, the co-signature, all of it. I want to say it clearly because I don't think I've said it clearly enough." He looked at her across the work table, and something in his face was quieter than usual, stripped of the practical efficiency that was his ordinary expression. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "I know I don't owe it," she said. "That's different from not wanting to give it." He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. You said you helped because I wasn't going to quit. Was that the whole of it?" The question landed in the warm air of the new bakery and sat there while he turned the cup another quarter rotation, and the November light came through the window in the long, thin lines it made in late fall. "No," he said. "That was the honest part of it. It wasn't the whole of it." She waited. "I have watched you run that bakery for 2 years," he said, looking at her steadily now, "and I think you are the most capable and the most determined person in this town, and I think you are also the loneliest, which you would never say and which I have no right to say, but it's what I believe. And I think I came across that street with a shovel because I wanted." He stopped. "What did you want?" Said very quietly. "I wanted to be useful to you," he said, "more than I wanted to say the right thing, because the right thing wouldn't have helped and the shovel would." She looked at him for a long moment. The whiskey was warm in her chest, and the bakery smelled of fresh pine and the ghost of bread, and the wind outside pushed against the new walls with a sound like a question. "You are the most unusual man I have met in a considerable time," she said. "I've been told that too," he said. "In what spirit?" "Usually critically," he said, and she laughed. And the laugh was different from the short, surprised one she'd given him on the first day. It was fuller, warmer, the laugh of someone who has begun to feel safe enough to be genuinely amused. He left an hour later, and she stood in the doorway of the new bakery and watched him walk down the street with his hat straight and his coat moving in the November wind, and she thought, with the careful honesty she tried to bring to herself, "This is beginning to be something." And she did not know what to do with that, So she went inside and scrubbed the work table until it shone. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was a hard one, as Kansas winters often were long and flat and ferociously cold, with the wind coming down from the north with nothing to stop it for 500 miles. The cattle trade slowed to a winter halt, and the town drew inward, and Matilda's bakery became a kind of hearth for it. She started serving hot coffee alongside the bread, and she put a bench in the front room, and people came in the mornings not just for the bread but to be somewhere warm with other people, which was a thing the winter made necessary. Graham came most mornings. He would come in and collect his bread for the week and drink a cup of coffee standing at the counter, and they would talk about whatever the day had brought: the weather, the price of cattle, a letter from the territorial governor about the new land laws, the matter of the printing shop owner who had gotten into a legal dispute with his partner and was threatening to close. He never stayed too long, and he never arrived at a time that suggested he was manufacturing an excuse to be there, and the regularity of it settled into Matilda's mornings like a fixed point she found herself orienting around. She learned things about him in those morning conversations. She learned that he had come from Ohio, where his family had a small farm, and that he had gone west at 22 not because things were bad there, but because the West had seemed to him like a place where a person's efforts were directly connected to their outcomes in a way that felt more honest than the established systems back east. He had tried Colorado first, then New Mexico Territory, then drifted north to Kansas and found Caldwell in the way that some people find places, by arriving at the right moment and recognizing something without quite being able to name it. He had not been married. She asked him about this one morning in January directly because she was not the kind of woman who asked sideways. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. "I was close to it once," he said, "back in Ohio. A woman named Clara, she decided she didn't want to go west, which was the right decision for her, and I didn't want to stay, which was the right decision for me. We both knew it when it came to it." "Was that hard?" "Yes," he said simply, "for a while. And after I understood it better," he said. "It's easier to understand a thing when you're not standing in the middle of the hurt of it." She thought about Daniel, about the fever that had taken him in 4 days, about the way she had understood his death better over time and not better at the same time, because understanding a thing and being at peace with it were not always the same motion. "My husband died in 1872, she said. "Fever, 4 days from first symptom to the end." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." "You're the first person to say that to me in a long time and sound like you mean it for me rather than for yourself," she said. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was not pity. It was the thing she had recognized on the first day, that particular quality of seeing someone whole rather than seeing their difficulty. "You must have loved him very much," he said. "I did," she said. "He was a good man. He was not the most practical man I have ever known, but he was good, and he was funny, and he painted that sign in July heat and got mortar all over himself and couldn't stop laughing at it. And she stopped, because her voice had done something it rarely did in public. Graham did not rush to fill the silence. He stood with his coffee cup and let her have the moment, and she took a breath and collected herself, and he did not make her feel that she had been weak. "He sounds like a man worth grieving," Graham said. "He was," she said. They looked at each other across the counter, and she felt it again, that counterweight shift, that sense of balance adjusting. She was not over Daniel. She suspected she would never be over Daniel in the way that some people imagined widows should be, as though grief had a final destination and a scheduled arrival. But she was past the worst of it, past the hollow weeks where she had gotten out of bed through pure stubbornness and nothing else, and she was in a place where the grief and the living had learned to occupy the same space without either one consuming the other. And she was beginning to understand, with an increasing certainty that made her both glad and cautious, that the tall, quiet man who came to her counter every morning and turned his cup in his hands and said true things without decoration, was someone she wanted in her life in a way that extended beyond business and gratitude. She did not say this. It was January, and they were still learning each other, and Matilda Gentry had learned from experience that the things worth having were generally not the things you rushed toward. February brought a blizzard that shut the town down for 3 days and left 6-foot drifts against the front door of the bakery. And on the second day, Graham appeared with a snow shovel and dug her out. And she opened the front window and handed him a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of jam. And he laughed, a full, genuine laugh that she had not heard from him before, low and warm, and she thought, there it is. There is the version of this man that lives behind the careful face, and she wanted to see it again. On the evening of the third day of the blizzard, when the snow had finally settled and the temperature had dropped to something extraordinary, Matilda was still in the bakery because the boarding house was a longer walk and the bakery had the better stove, and she heard a knock at the back door and opened it to find Graham standing in the snow with a cast iron pot. "Beef stew," he said. "My housekeeper made enough for a company of cavalry." She stepped back. He came inside and set the pot on the stove, and she got out 2 bowls from the shelf, and they sat at the work table with the stew and a loaf of bread she cut thick, and the wind howling outside in a way that made the inside feel sealed off from everything, a world of two contained in flower-scented warmth. They talked for a long time. They talked about Ohio and Missouri, about the differences between the flat country and the hilly country, and why some people needed one and some needed the other. They talked about books. He had a small collection of them, mostly history and natural science, and she had brought 3 novels and a volume of poetry from Missouri, and they discovered they had both read a well-worn copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which neither of them had expected to find in common, and debated the question of whether the creature or the doctor was more tragic, and she said the creature because he had not chosen the situation he was in. And he said the doctor because he had had the choice and made it wrong, and she thought about that for a moment and said maybe that was the truest kind of tragedy. He told her about the low lot he'd bought and how he'd put in drainage that first year, digging it himself in the spring mud, and how it had worked the first spring, and he'd felt the particular satisfaction of having solved a problem that everyone else had assumed was unsolvable. She told him about the first summer she'd run the bakery alone after Daniel died, how she had gotten up every morning at 4 and worked until dark and sometimes later, not because she was not grieving, but because the work was the only thing that felt real when everything else felt like it had become unreliable. "Was there ever a time when you considered leaving?" he asked. "Every day for about 3 months," she said honestly. "There was a moment in the middle of that first summer when I looked at the sign Daniel had painted and I thought I could go back to Missouri. My sister is in Missouri. There is nothing holding me here except a building and a business." "What kept you?" "The building and the business," she said. And then after a while the fact that I had kept going was itself a reason to keep going, which sounds circular but isn't. "No," he said. "It makes sense. You build the life you have by living it, and then the life itself becomes the investment." "Yes," she said, looking at him. "Exactly that." The wind pushed against the new walls and the stove crackled, and the lamplight was gold and warm. And she became aware, with a lucidity that sometimes comes with cold and quiet, that she was perfectly content in this exact moment, sitting across a wooden table from this man in her flower-smelling bakery, while the blizzard had its way with the world outside, and that this contentment was not the quiet, defeated kind, but the rich and particular kind that comes from being genuinely where you want to be. He left when the wind settled, close to 10 o'clock, and she watched him from the window walk through the white drifted street toward his property at the edge of town, and she did not know exactly when she had stopped thinking of him as a neighbor who had helped her and started thinking of him as someone she could not clearly imagine her mornings without, but she suspected it had been a while. Spring came to Caldwell in 1875, with the particular violence it always did on the Kansas plain, fast and wet, and followed almost immediately by the cattle season, which rolled in from the south in April with the trail herds and the noise and the money and the considerably increased need for bread. Matilda hired a girl, Emmy Dawes, who was 17 and quick and willing to learn, to help with the morning rush, and the bakery settled into its expanded season with a satisfying competence. She paid down the association loan in larger installments than required, because she did not like debt, and because the sooner the loan was retired, the sooner Graham's co-signature obligation was done, and that felt important to her in ways she had thought about carefully. Graham's cattle operation had its own spring expansion. He had taken on a contract with one of the larger trail outfits coming up from Texas and was running more cattle than the previous year, and his mornings at the bakery counter became slightly less regular but not absent. When he came, she noticed he always seemed to know what she had fresh that day, which suggested either that he was paying attention to her patterns or that he'd asked Emmy, which she discovered was in fact the case when Emmy, in a completely transparent attempt to be helpful, mentioned one morning that Mr. Whitaker had asked what you were baking Thursday so he could come in. Matilda said nothing to Emmy about this, but she made certain that Thursday's selection included the rye bread, which she had noticed he preferred. The spring also brought complications. The trail season meant that Caldwell acquired, as it always did, a temporary population of cowboys and drovers and assorted characters of variable character, and the general increase in noise and commerce brought with it the associated increase in conflict, which Sheriff Hollies managed with varying success. There were 2 fights in the saloon in April alone, and a dispute over a cattle count that got loud enough to reach Matilda's front windows, and a man who arrived in town one afternoon claiming he had a legal deed to a piece of land that someone else had been farming for 3 years, which led to a tense, several weeks of land office meetings and raised voices that were eventually settled when the territorial judge came through on his circuit. And then in May there was the matter of Roy Jasper. Roy Jasper had been driving cattle for the better part of 15 years, and he was good at it and he knew it. And he had the habit that some men develop in those circumstances of believing that competence in one area extended to an entitlement in all others. He was one of the drovers who had a regular bread account with Matilda, and he had been a perfectly adequate customer for 2 seasons, paying his account on time and taking his order without incident. But Roy Jasper had also, in the 2 seasons he'd done business with her, developed a way of looking at her that she did not care for, and in the way of some men who had been on the trail for months with no softness or ease around them, he had begun to translate whatever he thought he felt into a kind of ownership he had not earned and had not been offered. He came into the bakery on a Thursday in May when Emmy was out delivering to the hotel and Matilda was alone at the counter, and he leaned on the counter in a way that made her back straighten, and he said that a woman like her shouldn't be working so hard alone, and that he'd been thinking about it, and she had always seemed like a sensible woman, and he'd like to discuss an arrangement. She looked at him with the same flat calm she'd used to face the fire. "I'll take my usual order, Mr. Jasper," she said. "Now, Mrs. Gentry, I'm just trying to—" "I heard you," she said. "I'm not interested. Your order is 12 loaves of rye and 6 of wheat. That will be $1.40. His jaw tightened, and he put his hands flat on the counter and leaned in closer than was appropriate and said that he reckoned she was a little lonely, being a widow and all. And she looked at him for a steady 5 seconds and said, "Mr. Jasper, if you put your hands on my counter one more time instead of in your pockets to pay for your bread, I'm going to ask you to leave and stop your account, and you can explain to your trail boss why you've got no bread contract for the season." He straightened. He paid. He left. She was angrier than she looked, which she managed to contain until the door closed, and then she stood in the back room for 2 minutes and breathed through it, because she had dealt with men like Roy Jasper before, and she knew that the anger, however righteous, was a thing to process in private, so it didn't eat her from the inside. Graham found out about it the following morning. She did not know how, whether Emmy had mentioned it or whether word had simply traveled the way word did in small towns. And he came in with an expression that was more controlled than usual, which in him indicated more emotion rather than less. "Roy Jasper," he said, without preamble. "Word travels fast," she said. "Are you all right?" "I handled it," she said. "I know you did," he said in that same direct way. "I'm asking if you're all right." She looked at him for a moment. The question asked like that was different from the assumption she'd been braced for, which was the assumption that she needed someone to do something about it on her behalf. "I am angry," she said. "I was angry yesterday and I am less angry today, but it's still there." "That's a reasonable response," he said. "I'm not going to tell you what to do about it," she said, "because it's not yours to handle." "No," he agreed. "But Jasper's trail boss is a man named Abel Fitch, and I know Abel, and I think I'll mention to him in the course of ordinary conversation that there might be a character concern with one of his hands." She considered this. "That is not the same as fighting my battle." "No," he said. "It's maintaining a standard of conduct that serves the whole town, which is its own separate thing." "You are very good at framing things," she said. "I've had to be," he said, and she thought about that, about what it meant to be a man who had to be careful with how he said things, who had learned to navigate between intention and perception with precision, and she appreciated it the way she appreciated craftsmanship, which was with recognition and respect. Jasper finished out the cattle season without further incident and did not return to Caldwell the following year, which she heard was connected to a conversation between Graham and Fitch, but which she could not confirm and did not press. The summer of 1875 was the summer things changed more decisively between them, and it began, as many important things between people begin, with something small. She had a delivery wagon now, a small one, pulled by a steady mare she'd bought in June, and she was loading it one July morning before dawn when the back wheel came off its axle in a way that sent the whole side of the wagon down into the dirt, and 3 dozen loaves of hotel bread sliding toward catastrophe. She caught the bread, or most of it, and stood in the pre-dawn dark assessing the damage to the axle and calculating, with the speed of a woman who had been solving problems alone for 3 years, what it was going to cost her in time and lost income and aggravation. Graham's property was at the edge of town and he was always up before dawn because cattle did not observe human schedules, and she did not mean to stop at his fence on the way to the livery. She was just passing, she told herself, on the logical route, but the lantern in his barn was lit and the fence gate was open and she stopped. "Axle pin sheared," she said from the gate. "I have 37 loaves of hotel bread to deliver by 6. He came out of the barn with a lantern and looked at her and then at the wagon, which she had somehow managed to push to a leaning stop against the fence post, and said, "My wagon is bigger, but I can have it hitched in 10 minutes. I'll pay for the use of it." "Don't be ridiculous," he said, which was the first time he had said something to her with anything approaching sharpness, and it startled them both slightly. He looked at her for a moment and his expression did something more complicated. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean it that way. I only meant that lending a neighbor a wagon isn't the kind of thing that requires payment." She softened. "I know," she said. "I just don't like owing." "I know," he said. "You've mentioned it a few times. Have I been tiresome about it?" "No," he said. "You've been consistent, which is different, but you could occasionally accept a thing without the accounting of it." They looked at each other in the lantern light, and she was aware of how close she was standing to him, and aware that neither of them had moved to create more distance, and aware that the pre-dawn dark and the warm lamplight had a quality that was different from noon in the bakery or morning at the counter, something more private, more unguarded. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you for the wagon." "You're welcome," he said, and went to hitch it. She made her deliveries on time. When she brought the wagon back, he was in the yard working on a fence post, and she climbed down and came to the fence and he looked up. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. He stood and waited. "I think about you considerably more than is probably." She stopped, took a breath, tried again. "I think about our mornings at the counter more than I think about most things, and I think that means something that I have been not quite saying for a while now." He looked at her steadily across the fence rail. The morning sun was warm on the yard, and the cattle were moving in the distance, and a meadowlark was doing something extravagant in the field beyond. "I think about them too," he said. "I think about you considerably more than is probably." He used her phrase back at her with the ghost of that rare smile, "the ordinary amount." "What does that mean, in practical terms?" She asked because she was Matilda Gentry and she did not do well with things left at the level of implication. "It means," he said, "that if you were willing, I would like to court you, properly, in whatever way that means to you." She thought about it for perhaps 15 seconds, which was not as long as it might have appeared, because she had been thinking about it for considerably longer than that, and this was only the moment of confirming what she already knew. "I think I would like that," she said. He nodded, and the meadowlark continued its elaborate performance, and the morning was golden and wide, and full of the particular sweetness of something beginning. What courting looked like, between two people like Matilda Gentry and Graham Whitaker, was not the elaborate, formal affair that the term sometimes implied. It was more mornings at the counter, but with a quality of intention now that had not been there before, or rather, that had been there but unnamed. It was Sunday afternoon walks after church along the creek, where the cottonwoods had gone gold in September, and the water ran low and clear. It was dinner at the hotel on a Saturday evening when Mrs. Beaumont had set up a dining arrangement for the ladies' auxiliary fundraiser, and Graham had asked her if she'd like to attend. And she had worn the blue dress again, and he had worn his good coat, and they had sat across from each other at a corner table, and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. And he had brought her home to the boarding-house door and stood with his hat in his hands and looked at her in the September evening, with an expression that was so openly full of something that she had to look away for a moment. "Good night, Matilda," he said the first time he'd used her Christian name, which landed in the quiet street with the weight of something changed. "Good night, Graham," she said, and went inside. She stood inside the door for a full minute with her hand on the wood, and she was smiling and she was not attempting to stop. He kissed her for the first time in October, a year almost to the day from when he had first crossed the street with the shovel, and it happened not in any planned or dramatic way, but in the bakery, at the end of the day, when she was closing up, and he had come in to tell her something about the association loan. The last payment was approaching, and she had it ready, and somewhere in the middle of the practicalities of it, they had ended up standing close to each other with the lamplight warm around them. And she had said something he found funny, and he had laughed that full, warm laugh she still loved best. And when he stopped laughing, he was close, and she was looking at him, and the rest of it was simply inevitable, the way things that have been approaching for a long time finally arrive. It was a good kiss. It was honest and warm and unhurried. The way everything Graham did was unhurried, and she put her hands against his coat lapels and felt the solid reality of him and thought, "Yes, this is the thing I have been knowing for a year." When they stepped back, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the bakery smelled of the day's bread, and the October wind pushed at the windows. "I think," she said, "that we have probably both known this was coming for some time." "Since February, approximately," he said. "February? Which February event specifically?" "The blizzard," he said. "The stew. Frankenstein's creature," she laughed. "You decided during a debate about Frankenstein's creature." "I decided," he said, "that I wanted to be arguing about books with you for a very long time." She looked at him, and the feeling in her chest was not the girlish infatuation of first love. She had had that with Daniel, and it was its own beautiful thing, but something different, something that felt like coming to rest after a long walk, the particular satisfaction of arriving at a place that turns out to be exactly what you needed. "Good," she said. He proposed in December, on a Sunday afternoon by the creek where the cottonwoods were bare now, and the water had a skim of ice at the edges, and he did it simply, without dramatics, in keeping with everything about him. He said that he loved her and that he would like to spend his life with her if she was willing, and that he knew she was entirely capable of managing everything without him, but that he hoped she might find room for him in it regardless. She told him that she had found room for him in it some time ago, and yes. He put a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a small ruby in a gold setting, and she looked at it against her work-roughened hands and thought it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a long time. They were married in March of 1876, on a Saturday that was cold but clear, in the church with the leaking roof that the congregation had finally agreed to repair that winter. The Reverend Cates performed the ceremony, and the whole town came, or most of it, because in a town the size of Caldwell, a wedding was an event of general interest and goodwill. Mrs. Beaumont and the auxiliary had organized a reception at the hotel dining room. Old Pete from the livery polished his boots for the first time in memory. Emmy Dawes cried, which she blamed on dust, but which had nothing to do with dust. Matilda wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Landers had helped her make from fabric she'd ordered from a catalog in Kansas City, with small pearl buttons down the front that had cost more than she'd planned, but which she did not regret for a single moment. She carried a bunch of dried flowers, wildflowers from the creek that she'd picked and dried in the fall, because March in Kansas did not accommodate fresh ones. And she walked herself down the aisle of the church because she had no one to walk with her father having been gone since before Daniel. And she held her head straight and her shoulders back, and she walked toward Graham Whitaker, who was standing at the front of the church in his good coat looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Stripped of all the careful steadiness, entirely open, and she felt her eyes sting and blinked it back because she was not going to cry before she got to him. She got to him. He took her hand and she held it, and the Reverend said the words, and they said the words back, and she meant every one of them with the particular depth of a person who had already learned what it meant to lose, and to endure, and to choose again. They moved into Graham's house at the edge of town, a proper house by then, because he had added 2 rooms during the fall in preparation, and she had added to it her curtains and her books and the small things that made a space a home. She still kept the bakery, of course, because she was Matilda Gentry, Matilda Whitaker now. But she kept Gentry as the business name because it was what people knew, and because Daniel had painted the first sign, and it felt right to keep that much of it. And she still rose before dawn and still had the bread ready by 6. And now when she got home in the afternoons there was someone there, someone who asked about the day and had a day of his own to report. And the house smelled of coffee and leather and sometimes beef stew, and she settled into the life of it with the ease of something that was always meant to be exactly this. The first summer of their marriage was full, in the best sense. The cattle season brought its commerce and its noise, and Matilda had the bigger contract now, supplying 3 of the trail outfits directly, and Emmy Dawes had hired a younger sister to help in the bakery so that Matilda could manage the supply end of it from the wagon. Graham's cattle operation had grown to where he had 2 hands working for him, Tom Haggerty and a quiet young man named Cody Barnes who was 18 and learning everything as fast as he could take it in. And the afternoons sometimes brought all of them to the kitchen table for supper, which Matilda had discovered she did not mind at all. The kitchen table loud with talk and the smell of whatever she'd put on the stove. Graham at the head of it with his long legs stretched out, and that rare full laugh coming out when Tom told a story about the cattle. She had, by the end of that first year, paid back the association loan entirely. She paid the final installment herself in person at the land office, and she watched Cole Beaumont mark it paid and stamp the paper with a satisfaction that was almost physical. When she got home that evening, Graham was in the yard checking the fence, and she walked out and held up the stamped paper. He looked at it and then at her, and the slow smile spread across his face, the full version, not the corner-of-the-mouth version, and he said, "I never had any doubt. You were never nervous about it," she said. "Your co-signature." "No," he said simply. "That was either wisdom or folly," she said. "I prefer to think wisdom," he said. And she went to him and he folded his arms around her, and she stood in the evening light in the yard with her face against his chest, and thought that this was the shape of the life she had built. Ash and stone footings and fresh lumber, and a man with a shovel and the specific irreplaceable rightness of it. In the spring of 1877, she discovered she was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning when they were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand, and she watched his face move through something she didn't have a word for, a kind of deep, serious joy, the joy that knows it is large and is being careful with it. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I am very well. I am also. It is a lot, Graham." "Yes," he said. "It is a lot." They sat with it for a while, the coffee getting cool and the morning coming through the kitchen window in its spring-pale light. "I want to keep working as long as I can," she said. "I need you to know that." "I know that," he said. "I wouldn't ask you not to. Emmy can manage the morning rush and I'll come in later, Matilda," he said. "I know who you are. We'll work it out." She looked at him and felt again that thing she had noticed in the land office when he'd said, "I know you're capable," the quality of being seen whole, being known all the way through, being loved not despite the work and the independence and the stubbornness but including them, because they were part of the same whole. "All right," she said. Their son was born in November of 1877, in the first week of the month when the cold had come down, but the ground had not yet frozen, delivered by the town doctor, whose hands, it turned out, were quite steady before noon, with Mrs. Landers in attendance and Graham outside the door for 6 hours, which she could hear because he was not quite able to be still, which was the first time she had ever known him to be unable to be still, and it made her love him with a ferocity that surprised her even then, in the middle of everything. The boy came in fine and whole and loud, with his father's jaw already asserting itself and his mother's dark hair, and a set of opinions about the world that he communicated without reservation from the very first moment. They named him Daniel because she had said, quietly, one evening in the fall when they were talking about names, that she wanted to keep something of the man who had helped build the place they were living in, and Graham had said yes without a moment's hesitation, and that yes had meant more to her than almost anything. Daniel Whitaker was a child of the Kansas plains from the beginning, curious and stubborn and physical, always into something, always with a question. He was 2 years old when he escaped the yard and was found sitting in the middle of the road, eating a handful of dirt with what the passers-by described as great confidence. And he was 3 when he fell into the water trough and came up sputtering but not crying, which Graham said was a good sign, and Matilda said was both a good sign and an absolute disaster. He grew up between the bakery and the cattle yard, learning both worlds with the easy competence of a child who has 2 capable parents and unlimited space to stretch into. By 1879, Graham had expanded the operation again, taking on a larger contract with the Abilene shipping yards as the cattle trade shifted north with the railways, and Matilda had taken on a full-time assistant at the bakery so she could focus on the accounts and expansion, because she had been thinking for 2 years about adding a second location on the newer part of town where the rail workers were living and they needed feeding. She brought this idea to Graham on a Tuesday evening over supper when Daniel was asleep, laying out the numbers, and the plan with the same clarity she'd brought to Cole Beaumont 6 years earlier. Graham listened to all of it and then said, "The rail workers' side is going to grow, that's the right move." "I think so too," she said. "I'll need capital for the equipment." "I have capital," he said. She looked at him. "It is your money too," he said, meeting her eyes. "We are married, Matilda. Your business is our business." She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the $42 in the tin box and the $400 loan, and the long, careful work of paying it all back on her own terms. And she thought about what it meant to accept a thing without the accounting of it, which he had told her once was something she might occasionally try. "All right," she said. He smiled, full and warm. "All right," he said. The second location opened in the spring of 1880. It was smaller than the main street bakery, and it specialized in the heartier things, large loaves of dark bread and substantial rolls, and the kind of filling food that men doing heavy rail work wanted to fill their lunch pails with. And it was managed by Emmy Dawes' sister, Clara, who had turned out to be as able as Emmy and more direct. The business prospered. The town prospered. Caldwell in 1880 was a different place than Caldwell in 1874. More settled, more organized, with a proper school building now and a courthouse under discussion, and the faint but growing possibility that the wild, transitional quality that had defined it was giving way to something more permanent. This was, Matilda thought, both a gain and a loss. The place felt safer and more reliable and also slightly less itself. The way all growing things sometimes become less interesting as they become more established. But the people in it were the same people mostly, and the relationships were the same, built of accumulated time and shared difficulty, which was the real currency of small places. Tom Haggerty got married in the spring of 1880 to a woman from Wichita who came to Caldwell to visit her cousin and stayed because Tom asked her to. And Matilda baked the wedding cake, a 4-layer honey cake that she had been perfecting since the previous fall in preparation. And Graham delivered the toast at the reception with the straightforward warmth he brought to all things that mattered. And they came home after in the spring dark, and Daniel was asleep with his boots still on, and they put him properly to bed without waking him and came back to the kitchen and sat with the last of the evening. "Do you remember the first morning?" Graham asked. She looked at him across the table. "With the shovel, yes. I remember being surprised that you didn't say you were sorry," she said. "I thought sorry wasn't what you needed." "You were right," she said. "It wasn't. I needed someone to look at the foundation and tell me it was still good." He reached across the table, the same motion he'd made when she told him about the baby, and took her hand. "It was always good," he said. She held his hand, and the kitchen was quiet, and the night was mild, and Daniel's small snoring was barely audible from the next room, and the lamplight was gold on the table. And she thought about all of it, the fire and the ash and the stone footings, and the cold mornings with the shovel and the blizzard stew and Frankenstein's creature and the lone papers, and the ring and the wedding and the boy sleeping in the next room and the 2 bakeries, and the years of mornings with coffee and bread, and the shape of a life built, piece by piece, from something that had once seemed like nothing left. She thought about what she had been afraid of in those hollow months after Daniel died, when she had gotten out of bed by pure stubbornness, that the loss would be the end of the story, that it would define the rest of it, that there would be nothing on the other side of it except the enduring. There was, it turned out, so much on the other side of it. There was so much she had not imagined. "I love you," she said, because she did not say it as often as she thought it, and she thought that was something she could correct. He turned her hand over in his and looked at her with those creekwater eyes, serious and warm. "I love you," he said. "Every day since the blizzard and Frankenstein's creature," she laughed, and the laugh was full and easy, the laugh of a woman entirely at home in her life. "That is the most eccentric origin story for love that I have ever heard," she said. "It's ours," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." In 1881, Cody Barnes, who had been working for Graham since he was 18 and was now 23, and had learned the cattle business as thoroughly as any man in the county, brought his wages and 3 years of savings to Graham one February morning, and said he was thinking about buying the Tanner lot and starting his own operation, and asked Graham's honest opinion. Graham gave it without qualification, including both the ways it could succeed and the ways it could fail, and then helped Cody prepare a presentation for the bank. And Cody got his loan and spent the spring building his fence, and Graham spent 3 Saturday afternoons helping him stretch the wire, and Matilda sent meals over because she remembered what it felt like to be building something from the beginning with the sense that the whole weight of it was on you. That summer she found out she was expecting again. She told Graham on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table, and he took her hand the same way he had the first time, and the joy was the same, large and careful and serious. And Daniel, who was 3.5 and entirely perceptive, looked at both of them and said, "What?" with such perfect timing that they both laughed until they had to put their coffee cups down. Their daughter arrived in January of 1882, in the deep cold of a Kansas winter, and she came fast and indignant and with a great deal of immediate noise, which Mrs. Landers, who had been present again, said was a wonderful sign. They named her Rose, because it was January and they wanted something that had warmth in it, and she was from the very beginning a different kind of person than her brother, quieter and more watchful, with her mother's dark hair and her father's serious eyes, and a quality of attention that made you feel, when she looked at you, that she was already measuring the situation. Daniel was fascinated by her and also slightly resentful, in the honest way of small children who have not been the center of things before, and he went through 2 weeks of excessive noise, and asking to help with everything before settling into a kind of proprietary affection that showed itself as sitting close to her cot, and telling her about the cattle yard in a murmuring voice that he seemed to believe was useful, which it possibly was. The years that followed were full in the way that lives become full when the structure is right, not without difficulty, because difficulty was woven into the landscape of Kansas as surely as the grass and the wind, but with a solidity under everything that meant the difficulty was navigable rather than existential. There were bad cattle seasons and good ones. There was a drought in 1883 that made everyone lean and tense for a summer, and then broke in September with 3 days of rain that brought half the town out into the street to stand in it. The Main Street bakery needed a new oven in 1884, which cost more than expected, and the rail workers' side had a slow winter that year that required careful management, and all of it got managed. Graham turned 40 in 1883, and she made him a cake with the honey from the Kendall farm, a 3-layer thing with the word 40 written on it in icing because she was not sentimental enough to pretend the number wasn't there, and he looked at it and said, "You are a ruthless woman, Matilda Whitaker," and she said, "You knew that already," and he said, "Yes, I did, and I consider it one of your best qualities." She was 35 that year, and she felt it less in her body and more in the way she looked at the town and recognized it as hers, not owned. Nothing so simple as that, but woven into, embedded in, belonging to and belonged to by in the way that only comes from years of mutual investment. She knew the bakery by every board and nail. She knew the smell of the morning by season, the way the cold had a different quality in November than in January, the way the spring mud smelled when it first turned up, and the summer grass smell that came in June on the south wind. She knew Graham by the sound of his boots on the porch, and the particular quality of his silence when he was thinking through a problem, and the way he turned his coffee cup in his hands when he was uncertain about something, and the way his face changed, even after all the years, when he looked at her. She knew the children Daniel, who at 8 was a blur of energy and questions, and who was already following Graham around the cattle yard with the focused interest of a person who has found his thing, and Rose, who at 6 was reading better than her brother had at 8, and who had discovered that the bakery was a place of particular fascination to her, and who had taken to appearing at the counter on Saturday mornings and very seriously handing customers their bread parcels, which the customers found charming, and which Matilda found something more, found the first small visible sign of what Rose might make of her life. In the evenings after the children were in bed, she and Graham sat at the kitchen table or on the porch when the weather allowed, and she thought sometimes about the evening 6 years ago when she had stood in the boarding-house doorway after the first real dinner with him and pressed her hand against the door in the dark and smiled. And she thought that the version of herself then, the woman who had been so careful and so cautious and so accustomed to carrying everything alone, would not entirely recognize this version. Not because she had become a different person, but because she had become more fully herself, the parts of her that needed other soil having finally found it. She thought sometimes about what she might have told her 26-year-old self, standing in the ash and the wool blanket, watching the town come to offer their sorrow. She might have said, "There is going to be a man who crosses the street with a shovel instead, and it will seem strange to you at first, and then it will seem like the most natural thing in the world, because the right kind of help looks different from what you expect." She might have said, "The foundation is still good." She might have said, "You are going to be all right, but better than that, you are going to be more than all right, in ways you are not yet able to imagine." But she had not known those things then. You had to live them to know them. By the fall of 1885, Daniel was 11 and deeply committed to becoming a cattleman, a vocation he pursued with the focused intensity of someone who had made a decision and intended to honor it. He went out with Graham on the early rounds and was permitted, under close supervision, to help with the cattle management, and he had a way with the animals that made the hands say he was natural at it, which he received as the highest possible compliment. Rose was 9 and had moved past fascination with the bakery counter into an actual interest in the baking itself. She had taken to spending Tuesday afternoons in the bakery with her mother, learning the process with the same watchful seriousness she brought to everything, asking specific questions and remembering the answers. One Tuesday in October, which was apple season in Kansas, Matilda was teaching Rose to make proper pie, with the lattice crust that required patience and the specific ratio of sweetness to tartness in the filling that was the thing that made Matilda's pies what they were. And Rose was at the table with the rolling pin, working the crust with total concentration, and Matilda was watching her and thinking that this child, this serious, watchful child, was going to do something remarkable with her life. Whatever that turned out to be. "Mother," Rose said, without looking up from the crust, "how did you and Father decide to be married?" Matilda considered the question. The answer was long. "He brought me a shovel," she said. Rose looked up. "A shovel. After the fire," Matilda said. "Everyone in town came to say how sorry they were. Your father came across the street with a shovel and told me the foundation was still good and we should clear the site." Rose looked at her with those serious eyes. "That is not a very romantic beginning," she said. Matilda smiled. "No," she said, "it was a very practical beginning." Which turned out to be exactly the right beginning for two people like us. Rose appeared to consider this with the gravity it deserved, then returned to the pie crust. "I think I understand," she said, in the tone of someone making a note of something for future reference. The pie came out well, excellent, in fact, the crust even and the filling properly balanced, and Rose looked at it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has made a real thing and knows it. Graham came into the bakery at closing time, which he did sometimes on the days he knew Rose was working there, and he looked at the pie on the cooling rack and then at Rose, who was straightening up the flour sacks with the methodical care she brought to all tasks. "That yours," he said. "Mother guided me," Rose said, "but my hands made it." "That's how it works," he said, and looked at Matilda, and there was that expression again, the one she had never found a single word for, that open, serious joy. They ate the pie that evening at the kitchen table, all four of them, with the October dark outside and the lamp burning warm and Daniel debating, with great energy, the relative merits of two different fence post strategies he'd been discussing with Tom Haggerty, and Rose listening to him with the patience she'd been developing since she was born, and Graham across the table from her with the pie and the lamplight, and 11 years of mornings and evenings between them. She looked at him over the table and he caught her looking, and the look between them was the look of people who have built something together over a long time and know exactly what it is worth. The pie was very good. The winter of 1885 came cold and early, and they settled into it the way they settled into all winters by now, with the competent ease of people who know the shape of a season and are ready for it. The bakery had its winter routines, the cattle had their winter care, the children had school and the long evenings of reading and the particular pleasure of being inside while the wind did what it liked outside. The house was warm and full, and Matilda thought sometimes that the warmth was the most remarkable thing, not just the stove, but the warmth of a house that was inhabited by people who chose to be in it together. She still rose before dawn and still had the first loaves ready before 6, and she still came home in the afternoon to a house where someone was there, and she still sat at the kitchen table with Graham in the evenings after the children were in bed, and they talked about whatever the day had brought. And she still found him, after 11 years of marriage and 12 years of knowing him, to be the most interesting person in her life to talk to, not because he was the most talkative, he was famously not, but because he listened and thought and said true things without decoration, and because he had never, not once in all those years, looked at her and seen something less than what she was. On a December evening, close to Christmas of 1885, with snow on the ground and the children finally asleep after a long day of festive excitement, she sat across the table from him with the last of the evening coffee, and she looked at him, at the face that was more weathered now than it had been but no less itself, at the dark hair that had gone gray at the temples in a way she found distinguished, and told him so whenever he expressed any doubt, at the creek-water eyes that were the same as they had always been, and she thought about everything the two of them had made, 2 children, healthy and whole and already becoming themselves, 2 bakeries, a cattle operation that had grown from stubbornness and a low wet lot into something real and lasting, a house that was a home, a life that was, by any honest accounting, more than she had known to hope for on the morning she sat in the street in her nightgown with $42 and a wool blanket. And all of it had begun with a man who had crossed the street with a shovel and looked at the foundation and told her it was good. "I was thinking about the fire today," she said. He looked at her. "What about it?" "I was thinking about that morning, about all the people who came to tell me how sorry they were. And me," he said. "And you," she said, "with the shovel." "It seemed like the useful thing," he said, the same words he might have said 11 years ago. "It was," she said. "It was the most useful thing anyone has ever done for me, not because of the shovel, or not only because of the shovel, but because you looked at what was left and you saw that it was enough to build from." He was quiet for a moment, in the way that he was quiet when something had landed in him and he was letting it settle before he responded. "You were always enough to build from," he said. "The shovel was just to move the ash." She looked at him across the table, across the lamplight and the coffee cups and the years. "I love you, Graham Whitaker," she said. "I have loved you since February of 1875, and a debate about Frankenstein's creature, and I am going to love you until I am done." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same motion, the same warmth. "I love you, Matilda," he said. "I have loved you since I walked across that street, and you said all right to a shovel with no ceremony whatsoever, because it was the most you thing you have ever done, and you had not even done most of the most you things yet." She laughed warm and full. "That is a very peculiar declaration of love," she said. "It's the honest one," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." Outside, the Kansas winter was doing what it always did, pressing cold and flat and enormous against the walls of everything human beings tried to build against it. Inside, the lamplight was gold and warm, and the children were asleep, and the coffee was cooling, and the hands across the table held steady and sure, and Matilda Gentry, who had become Matilda Whitaker, who had been a widow and a baker and a borrower and a builder and a mother and a wife, and always, in the most essential part of herself, precisely herself, sat in the warmth of everything she had made and felt, with a clarity that was rare and wonderful and real. That she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The foundation had been good all along. It had only needed someone to see it clearly and someone to pick up the shovel and someone willing to say all right and begin. She had found all three in the same man, walking across the street in the October morning light, with no pity and no sympathy and nothing to offer but the willingness to start. And that, in the end, had been more than enough. It had been everything.